Welcome, fellow night owls. Before we begin tonight's journey through history, I invite you to settle in and get comfortable. Whether you're lying in bed with the lights low or listening quietly from a favorite chair, let this be your time to unwind. Take a deep breath, relax your shoulders, and let the day slowly drift away. In this video, we'll explore what life was like during the slow and quiet collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Not from the perspective of emperors and generals, but through the eyes of everyday people who lived through it. Their world was changing, sometimes in ways so subtle they barely noticed. And now, centuries later, we'll follow their footsteps, with calm narration to help lull your mind into rest. If you enjoy this kind of peaceful, thoughtful content, feel free to subscribe. It helps more than you know. And as you begin to drift off, I'd love it if you left a little comment letting us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always a comforting reminder of how many of us are winding down together across different corners of the world. Now, let the sounds of history carry you softly into sleep. The story begins. As the Western Roman Empire entered its final century of existence, life for its citizens had become a far cry from the splendor and stability enjoyed during the Pax Romana of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Gone were the days of effortless travel along well-maintained roads stretching from Britannia to Egypt. The grand temples, bathhouses, and forums that had once bustled with activity now fell into disrepair as the empire's coffers ran dry. The eternal city of Rome itself, the very heart of the empire, saw its population dwindle from over 1 million at its height to a mere 30,000 by the end. For those living through the decline, a sense of unease and uncertainty hung in the air. The old gods seemed to have abandoned them. Their prayers met with silence as the world they knew crumbled around them. In the countryside, farmers tilled their fields with one eye always on the horizon, fearing the next raid by barbarian tribes emboldened by the empire's weakness. The once formidable Roman legions, their ranks now filled with foreign mercenaries of questionable loyalty, struggled to hold the frontiers against the relentless tide of invaders. In the cities, the mood was one of resignation and despair. The great public works projects that had employed so many now lay abandoned, the aqueducts and roads falling into ruin. The wealthy elite retreated into their fortified villas, hoarding what little wealth remained as the economy collapsed around them. For the poor, life became a daily struggle for survival. Their meager rations stretched thin as the grain dole that had once fed the masses dwindled to a trickle. Yet even amidst the chaos and decline, pockets of normalcy persisted. In the marketplaces, merchants still hawked their wares, though the once exotic goods from far-flung corners of the empire were now few and far between. In the taverns and inns, people gathered to share a meal and a drink, seeking solace in the company of others as the world outside grew ever more uncertain. And in the churches, a new faith offered hope to the downtrodden, promising salvation and a better life in the world to come. As the empire's borders continued to contract and the barbarian tribes drew ever closer to the gates of Rome itself, those who remained clung to what little stability they could find in their daily lives. They tended their gardens, repaired their homes, and cherished their families, knowing that each day could be their last. And when the final blow came and the last emperor was deposed, they faced the unknown future with a mix of fear and resignation, knowing that the world they had once known was gone forever, but that life in some form would go on. As the sun rose over the 7 hills of Rome, the city stirred to life, but the sense of unease was palpable. The once mighty Roman Empire, which had stood for centuries as a beacon of civilization, was crumbling from within. The streets, which had once bustled with the energy of a thriving metropolis, now felt subdued and uncertain. For the average Roman citizen, daily life went on, but the signs of decay were everywhere. The grand public works and monuments that had symbolized Rome's power and glory were falling into disrepair. The aqueducts, which had once provided the city with a steady supply of fresh water, were now leaking and unreliable. The great public baths, where Romans had once gathered to socialize and relax, were now overcrowded and poorly maintained. The city's economy was also in shambles. The once thriving trade networks that had brought wealth and prosperity to Rome were now disrupted by barbarian invasions and political instability. Merchants struggled to bring in goods from the far reaches of the empire, and prices for everyday necessities skyrocketed. The poor and middle class found it increasingly difficult to make ends meet. Despite the hardships, Romans tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Families still gathered for meals, sharing what meager rations they could afford. Children still played in the streets, their laughter a temporary respite from the gloom that hung over the city. In the evenings, people still sought entertainment at the theatre or the chariot races, though the spectacles were a far cry from the lavish productions of Rome's golden age. In the halls of power, the mood was even more somber. The once mighty Roman Senate, which had guided the empire through countless crises, now seemed helpless in the face of the mounting challenges. Emperors came and went with alarming frequency, often meeting violent ends at the hands of rival factions or their own guards. The Praetorian Guard, once the loyal protectors of the emperor, now wielded their power for their own gain, selling their allegiance to the highest bidder. As the empire's borders crumbled and the barbarian hordes drew ever closer, the people of Rome could only watch and wait, hoping against hope that their once great civilization could weather the storm. But deep down, they knew that the glory days of Rome were fading, and that the world they had known was slowly slipping away. It was a time of uncertainty and fear, but also a time of resilience and hope, as the people of Rome faced the fall of an empire, one day at a time. Welcome, dear listener, to this special journey through history. In this series, we'll be exploring what life was like for the people who witnessed the decline and fall of the Western Roman Empire. Our aim is not just to recount the grand political and military events you may have heard about, but to paint a rich, immersive picture of daily life during this transformative era. Through vivid stories and fascinating historical details, we'll transport you back in time to walk the streets of fading Roman cities, experience the challenges and triumphs of ordinary people, and understand how it might have felt to watch a mighty civilization slowly crumble. All the while, my soothing voice will help you unwind, relax, and drift off into a peaceful slumber. So make yourself comfortable, dear listener. Dim the lights if you wish, and let your mind wander with me into the distant past. Don't feel the need to catch every word or remember every fact. Just let the calming cadence of the story wash over you as you sink deeper into relaxation. In each episode, we'll explore a different aspect of life during Rome's twilight years, from the bustling marketplaces and grand villas of the elite, to the humble workshops and crowded tenements of the common folk. We'll meet people from all walks of life: senators and slaves, soldiers and merchants, artisans and farmers, and hear their stories of love, loss, faith, and resilience in the face of an uncertain future. As you drift off to sleep, let your imagination roam the winding streets and rolling hills of a world long past, yet still intriguing and relevant to our lives today. Tomorrow night, our journey will continue. But for now, simply rest and let the story soothe you into a deep and refreshing slumber. Good night, dear listener, and sweet dreams. As the Western Roman Empire continued its gradual decline, life for the average Roman citizen became increasingly uncertain and chaotic. The once mighty empire that had dominated the Mediterranean world for centuries was now beset by invasions, political instability, economic turmoil, and social upheaval. It's a fascinating period of history to explore, especially when seeking a calming yet engaging topic to drift off to sleep to. The fall of Rome didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, complex process that unfolded over several centuries. The exact dates are debated by historians, but most agree that the decline began in the late 3rd century CE and culminated with the deposition of the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 CE. During this tumultuous era, the empire faced a myriad of challenges both from within and without. Externally, Rome was under constant pressure from various barbarian tribes, such as the Goths, Vandals, and Huns, who sought to carve out their own territories from the weakening empire. These groups launched frequent raids and invasions, chipping away at Rome's borders and sapping its resources. Internally, the empire was plagued by a series of weak and ineffective emperors, many of whom were more concerned with their own power and wealth than the welfare of their subjects. As a result, life for the average Roman became increasingly difficult and unpredictable. The once thriving cities began to decline as trade routes were disrupted and the economy faltered. Many people fled to the countryside in search of safety and stability, leading to a gradual depopulation of urban centres. Those who remained often faced food shortages, disease outbreaks, and the constant threat of violence. Despite these challenges, life went on for the Romans. They continued to work, worship, and find moments of joy and connection with their loved ones. The fall of Rome was a slow, gradual process, and for many, the changes were so subtle that they may have hardly noticed them from day to day. It's this human resilience and adaptability in the face of adversity that makes this period of history so compelling to explore, especially when seeking a soothing and thought-provoking topic to help lull the mind to sleep. By the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, the once mighty Roman Empire found itself in a state of gradual decline. The Pax Romana, or Roman peace, which had brought stability and prosperity to the Mediterranean world for centuries, was beginning to crumble. The empire faced a myriad of challenges, both from within its borders and beyond. Internally, political instability had become a recurring theme. The imperial succession was no longer a smooth process, as it had been during the empire's golden age. Instead, the throne was often claimed by military strongmen who rose to power through force of arms. These emperors, known as barracks emperors, were often short-lived, their reigns cut short by assassination or military defeat. This constant turnover of power left the empire without consistent leadership and made it difficult to address the many problems it faced. One of these problems was the increasing pressure on Rome's borders. For centuries, the empire had been able to keep its enemies at bay through a combination of military might and diplomatic savvy. However, by the 3rd century, the Germanic tribes to the north and the Persian Empire to the east had grown more powerful and more aggressive. They launched frequent raids into Roman territory, testing the limits of the empire's defences. In response, the Romans were forced to divert more and more resources to the frontiers, leaving the interior of the empire vulnerable. Economic troubles also plagued the empire during this period. The cost of maintaining a vast military machine and a sprawling bureaucracy had become unsustainable. To make matters worse, the empire's currency had been debased over time, leading to inflation and a loss of confidence in the monetary system. Trade, which had once been the lifeblood of the Roman economy, began to falter as a result. Despite these challenges, life in the Roman Empire went on. In the cities, the wealthy still enjoyed the comforts and luxuries that had been a hallmark of Roman civilization for centuries. They lived in grand villas adorned with mosaics and frescoes, attended the theatre and the games, and dined on exotic delicacies from across the empire. However, even the rich were not immune to the sense of unease that had crept over the empire. For the poor, life was a constant struggle. Many flocked to the cities in search of opportunity, only to find themselves living in crowded, unsanitary conditions. They worked long hours for low wages, barely able to make ends meet. In times of crisis, they were the first to suffer, as food shortages and disease outbreaks took their toll. In the countryside, the situation was not much better. The once prosperous villas that had dotted the landscape were falling into disrepair, as the wealthy landowners who had once maintained them withdrew to the safety of the cities. The small farmers who worked the land found themselves burdened with ever-increasing taxes and subjected to the depredations of roving bandits and invading armies. Yet even in these trying times, there were glimmers of hope. Christianity, which had once been a small, persecuted sect, was now the official religion of the empire. Its message of salvation and eternal life offered comfort to those who were suffering in this world. The church became a source of stability and support for many, providing food and shelter to the needy and offering a sense of community in an increasingly fragmented world. As the 4th century dawned, the Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self. Its borders were under constant threat, its economy was in shambles, and its political system was in disarray. Yet the empire had endured crises before and had always managed to bounce back. The question was whether it could do so again, or whether the challenges it faced this time were simply too great to overcome. Only time would tell. As the Western Roman Empire entered its final decades, political instability and economic woes became the norm. The once mighty empire found itself beset by a revolving door of emperors, with army generals and powerful nobles vying for control in an endless cycle of intrigue and betrayal. Emperors would rise to power only to be deposed or assassinated within a few short years, or even months. This constant upheaval made it nearly impossible for any kind of consistent, effective governance. Against this backdrop of political chaos, the empire's economy was also in shambles. Heavy taxation, needed to fund the bloated bureaucracy and constant military campaigns, placed a tremendous burden on the common people. Trade, which had once flourished across the vast Mediterranean, began to break down as roads and ports fell into disrepair and bandits and pirates preyed on merchants. The silver and gold content of Roman coins was gradually reduced to fund government spending, leading to rampant inflation. Once prosperous cities began to shrink as people fled to the countryside to escape the high cost of living and urban decay. The hardships of this era fell particularly hard on the poorest Romans. While the wealthy elite could retreat to their lavish villas and insulate themselves from the worst of the troubles, common folk struggled to make ends meet. Many became destitute and relied on the charity of the church or the dwindling bread dole to survive. Some abandoned their farms and joined the swelling ranks of the unemployed in cities, hoping for any scrap of work. The economic inequality between rich and poor grew into a yawning chasm. Yet even as their world crumbled around them, Romans strove to maintain some semblance of normalcy. The games at the Colosseum, though a shadow of their former glory, still drew crowds. Senators still met and debated, even as their authority dwindled. Priests and bishops still tended their flocks, offering both spiritual guidance and worldly aid. parents still sought to educate their children and pass down their traditions. Life went on, but the stress and strain were unmistakable. The once unshakable foundations of Roman society were cracking, eroded by years of mismanagement and misfortune. The fall was coming, and on some level everyone knew it, even if they tried to deny it. The halcyon days of Rome's golden age were fading into memory, replaced by an uncertain and tumultuous new era. As the Western Roman Empire continued its gradual decline, the threats from foreign invaders only grew more dire with each passing year. Tribes that had long lived on the fringes of the empire, held at bay by the might of Rome's legions, now sensed weakness. They began to test the borders, probing for gaps in defences and opportunities to strike. The Visigoths, a Germanic people who had clashed with Rome for centuries, were among the first to take advantage of the empire's vulnerability. In the year 410, they launched a daring assault on the city of Rome itself, breaching its walls and subjecting its inhabitants to 3 days of looting and terror. Though they eventually withdrew, their incursions sent shockwaves throughout the empire and marked a grim turning point. The Eternal City was no longer inviolable. Other tribes soon followed the Visigoths' lead. The Vandals, originally from Eastern Europe, swept through Gaul and Iberia before crossing into North Africa, where they established their own kingdom, centered on the great city of Carthage. Their most audacious attack came in 455, when they sailed up the Tiber and sacked Rome, stripping it of its wealth and captives. To the north, the Franks, Alemanni and Burgundians carved out their own territories from the carcass of Rome's European provinces. In Britain, no longer protected by the legions, Celtic and Germanic peoples fought for control. The empire was quite literally being pulled apart. For those living through these dark times, the world must have seemed a frightening and uncertain place. The security and stability that Rome had provided for centuries was crumbling before their eyes. Barbarian armies, once a distant menace, now roamed the land with impunity, leaving destruction in their wake. Many must have wondered if their civilization and all its achievements could possibly survive. Yet even as the Western Empire fragmented politically, the rhythms of daily life carried on. Farmers still tilled their fields, artisans plied their trades, and scholars debated philosophy and theology. The empire's cultural and economic influence, built up over hundreds of years, did not simply evaporate overnight. It persisted in the art, architecture, language and customs of the successor states that began to take shape. The fall of Rome was as much a gradual transformation as a cataclysmic event. It unfolded over generations as a complex web of internal weaknesses and external pressures slowly unraveled the imperial order. But for the people who lived through it, buffeted by forces beyond their control, it must have felt like the end of the world they had always known. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled under the weight of internal strife and external threats, everyday life for the average Roman citizen grew increasingly uncertain and chaotic. The once mighty empire, which had brought stability, prosperity, and a sense of shared identity to millions, now seemed to be unraveling at the seams. In the bustling streets of Rome and other major cities, the signs of decline were everywhere. Public infrastructure, including roads, aqueducts, and buildings, fell into disrepair as government funding dwindled and corruption ran rampant. The famed Roman baths, once a hub of social interaction and leisure, began to close down as the cost of maintaining them became too burdensome. The grand spectacles at the Colosseum and other amphitheatres, which had long served as a means of pacifying and entertaining the masses, grew less frequent and less impressive as resources grew scarce. For the common people, daily life became a struggle for survival. The economy was in shambles, with rampant inflation and a devalued currency, making it difficult for families to afford even basic necessities. Food shortages were common, as the empire's once reliable trade networks broke down, and agricultural production declined due to a combination of factors, including climate change, soil exhaustion, and the loss of slave labor. Many Romans found themselves resorting to subsistence farming or relying on the charity of the church and wealthy patrons to make ends meet. The breakdown of law and order also had a profound impact on everyday life. As the empire's borders crumbled and central authority waned, banditry and lawlessness became widespread. Travel became increasingly perilous, with roads no longer safe for merchants and pilgrims alike. In the cities, crime and violence were on the rise as desperate people turned to theft and other criminal activities to survive. The once vaunted Roman justice system, which had been a model of fairness and efficiency, became corrupt and ineffective, with bribery and political influence often determining the outcome of legal disputes. Despite the hardships and uncertainties of this period, life went on for the Roman people. Families still gathered around the hearth to share meals and stories. Children still played in the streets and attended school when possible. And communities still came together to celebrate festivals and mark important milestones. The rise of Christianity also provided a source of hope and comfort for many, with the church taking on an increasingly important role in providing social services and a sense of belonging in a world that seemed to be falling apart. Yet, even as they clung to these familiar rituals and institutions, Romans could not escape the sense that their world was changing in profound and irreversible ways. The old certainties of the Pax Romana, with its promise of peace, prosperity, and a shared cultural identity, were giving way to a new era of chaos, fragmentation, and uncertainty. For the average Roman, caught between the fading glory of the past and the gathering shadows of the future, life during the fall of Rome was a constant struggle to adapt and survive in a world that was rapidly slipping away. As the crisis of the 3rd century wore on, a new emperor would rise to power and implement sweeping reforms in a valiant attempt to stabilize the faltering empire. His name was Diocletian. Born to a humble family in the Roman province of Dalmatia, Diocletian had ascended through the military ranks with cunning and skill. In the year 284, after the dust had settled from the murder of the previous emperor Numerian, Diocletian was proclaimed emperor by his loyal troops. Diocletian recognized that the empire had simply grown too large and unwieldy for one man to effectively rule alone. In a bold move, he divided the empire into two halves, the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East. He then appointed a co-emperor, Maximian, to rule over the western provinces, while Diocletian himself oversaw the east from his capital at Nicomedia. This system, known as the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four, was further refined in 293 when each emperor took on a junior co-emperor, or Caesar, as an apprentice and successor. The empire was now divided into 4 realms, with 4 emperors sharing power and responsibility. Diocletian hoped that this division would make the empire more manageable and allow for smoother transitions of power. No longer would the death of an emperor plunge the empire into chaos and civil war, as rival claimants fought for the throne. Diocletian also sought to address the economic woes that had long plagued the empire. He attempted to curb inflation by issuing the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301, which set fixed prices for a wide range of goods and services. Though well-intentioned, this edict proved largely unenforceable and ultimately ineffective at halting the empire's economic decline. In matters of religion, Diocletian was a staunch traditionalist. he viewed the rise of Christianity as a threat to Rome's ancestral pagan religion and to the very stability of the empire itself. In 303, he issued a series of edicts ordering the destruction of Christian scriptures and churches and decreeing that Christians must make sacrifices to the Roman gods or face imprisonment and execution. This great persecution, as it came to be known, would be the last and most severe persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. After a 20-year reign, Diocletian made the stunning decision to voluntarily abdicate the throne in 305, retiring to his palace in Split on the Dalmatian coast. He thus became the first Roman emperor to ever resign the purple willingly. His elaborate palace, much of which still stands today, was a fitting reward for a man who had dedicated his life to the service and preservation of the empire. Yet for all his efforts, Diocletian's reforms would ultimately prove insufficient to reverse the empire's declining fortunes. The tetrarchy collapsed soon after his abdication, consumed by the same rivalries and power struggles it was meant to prevent. The empire itself would endure for another century in the west and another millennium in the east, but its glory days were now behind it. Diocletian's reign marked the beginning of the end for the once indomitable Roman Empire. As the Western Roman Empire entered the 5th century AD, it was a mere shadow of its former glory. Decades of invasions, political instability, economic decline, and over-reliance on barbarian mercenaries had left Rome vulnerable. The Eternal City itself had not been sacked by a foreign enemy in almost 800 years, not since the Gauls breached its gates in 390 BC. But that was all about to change. In the year 410, the unthinkable happened. An army of Visigoths, led by their king Alaric, laid siege to Rome and ultimately captured and looted the capital of the once mighty empire. This event sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world and has been seen by many historians as a major catalyst in the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Visigoths were a Germanic people who had long been thorns in the side of Rome. In the late 4th century, pressured by the invading Huns, they sought refuge within the empire's borders. The Romans allowed them to settle on the condition that they provide soldiers for the imperial army. However, they were often treated poorly, denied the payment and supplies they were promised. Alaric himself had previously been a commander in the Roman military, but now felt betrayed. Tensions boiled over in the early 400s AD, as the Visigoths, with Alaric now as their king, went on the warpath. They rampaged through the Balkans and then set their sights on Italy itself. In 408, Alaric's forces laid siege to Rome, cutting off the food supply to the city. The Senate, with no other options, was forced to pay a hefty ransom, including £5,000 of gold, £30,000 of silver, and 4,000 silken tunics to lift the siege. But it was only a temporary reprieve. Political machinations in Ravenna, the seat of the Western Emperor Honorius, led to the massacre of Goths in the Roman military and the families of Gothic Federati, allied troops. Alaric was enraged and once again marched on Rome, bent on revenge. This time, the Visigoths found that taking the city would be easier than expected. On August 24th, 410, the Salarian Gate was opened to Alaric's troops, possibly by Gothic slaves inside the city. The Visigoths poured in, and Rome's fate was sealed. What followed was 3 days of looting, pillaging, and destruction, a methodical sacking of the city that had ruled the Mediterranean world for centuries. The Visigoths were Christians, albeit following the Arian sect considered heretical by the Catholic Church. As such, Alaric ordered that the sanctity of churches be respected. Many Romans took refuge in these holy places, but other than sparing churches and those within them, the Goths plundered at will. They stripped temples and public buildings of their valuables. They ransacked private homes, taking not only riches, but also people as slaves. Priceless works of art were destroyed or melted down. The very psychological impact on the Romans, who considered their city divinely protected, was immense. The sack of 410 was nonetheless restrained by the standards of the ancient world. There was not a mass slaughter of the inhabitants. Certain parts of the city were burned, but it was not razed to the ground. After 3 days, Alaric led his forces out, heading south with their booty and leaving a shaken Rome behind. News of the sack reverberated around the Mediterranean. To many, it was a sign that the old order was crumbling. The great Christian thinker Saint Jerome, upon hearing of the event, wrote, "The city, which had taken the whole world, was itself taken." The city of Rome would be sacked again by the Vandals in 455 AD, but it was the fall to Alaric's Visigoths that truly marked the beginning of the end. The Roman Empire would limp on in the West for a few more decades before its final fall, but the world would never be the same. The old certainties were gone, shattered like the gilded monuments of Rome. A new age of faith was beginning, even as political power ebbed away from the Caput Mundi, the capital of the world. The sack of 410 AD was more than just a military defeat. It was a turning point in history, the end of an era, and the start of the long twilight of the Roman Empire in the West. As the 4th century drew to a close, the Western Roman Empire found itself beset by numerous challenges, both from within and without. Political instability, economic strife, and social unrest had left the once mighty empire in a precarious position. The stage was set for a momentous event that would shake the foundations of the Roman world: the invasion of the Visigoths under their formidable leader, Alaric. The Visigoths, a Germanic people who had long lived along the empire's borders, had a complex history with Rome. They had served as both allies and adversaries, at times fighting alongside Roman armies and at others clashing with them on the battlefield. In the latter half of the 4th century, the Visigoths found themselves facing a new threat: the relentless advance of the Huns from the east. Seeking refuge from the onslaught, the Visigoths petitioned the Roman Emperor Valens to allow them to cross the Danube and settle within the empire's borders. Valens, seeing an opportunity to bolster his military ranks, agreed to the Visigoths' request. However, the settlement process was fraught with difficulties and mismanagement. Roman officials, tasked with overseeing the Visigoths' integration into imperial lands, often exploited and mistreated the newcomers. They forced the Visigoths to trade their possessions for dog meat, separated families, and subjected them to various indignities. Tensions between the Visigoths and their Roman hosts began to simmer. The mistreatment of the Visigoths reached a boiling point in 378 CE, when a group of Gothic warriors were invited to a feast by Roman commanders. What was meant to be a diplomatic gesture turned into a massacre as the Romans attacked and killed the unsuspecting Goths. This treacherous act, known as the Battle of Adrianople, sparked a full-scale rebellion among the Visigoths. Led by a charismatic and capable leader named Fritigern, the Visigoths rose up against their Roman oppressors and won a stunning victory against Valens's forces. The emperor himself was killed in the battle, a shocking blow to Roman prestige. In the wake of the Battle of Adrianople, the Visigoths found themselves in a position of strength. They had defeated a Roman army and killed an emperor, demonstrating their formidable military prowess. However, in the years that followed, the Visigoths faced internal struggles and leadership changes. It was during this time that a new leader emerged: Alaric. Alaric, who had once served in the Roman army, was a cunning and ambitious man. He saw in the Visigoths' recent successes an opportunity to carve out a place for his people within the Roman Empire. In 395 CE, Alaric was elected king of the Visigoths, and he immediately set about consolidating his power and planning his next moves. Under Alaric's leadership, the Visigoths began a series of campaigns that would take them deep into the heart of the Western Roman Empire. They ravaged the Balkans and Greece, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Alaric's ultimate goal, however, was the city of Rome itself. He saw the conquest of the Eternal City as the key to securing a permanent home for his people and achieving lasting glory. As the 5th century dawned, the stage was set for a confrontation between Alaric's Visigoths and the forces of the Western Roman Empire. The events that would unfold in the coming years would forever change the course of European history and hasten the fall of one of the greatest empires the world had ever known. As the Visigoths breached the city walls and poured into Rome, the once mighty capital descended into utter chaos and destruction. The streets erupted into a cacophony of clashing swords, galloping hooves, and the desperate screams of fleeing citizens. Flames licked at the grand marble buildings, casting an eerie orange glow against the smoke-filled sky. The scent of burning wood mingled with the metallic tang of spilled blood, creating a suffocating atmosphere of terror and despair. Barbarian warriors, clad in crude armor and wielding fierce weapons, rampaged through the city with wild abandon. They smashed through the ornate doors of patrician villas, plundering the riches within and setting fire to what remained. Priceless works of art, painstakingly crafted over generations, were carelessly shattered or tossed onto the growing pyres. The once proud statues of gods and emperors lay toppled in the streets, their stone faces bearing witness to the unfolding devastation. Panicked residents ran through the narrow alleyways, desperately seeking shelter from the relentless onslaught. Some huddled in the shadows of crumbling temples, praying for divine intervention that would never come. Others made a frantic dash for the city gates, hoping to escape the carnage, only to be cut down by the merciless blades of the invaders. The air was filled with the wails of the wounded and the dying, a haunting chorus that echoed through the once vibrant streets. As the night wore on, the great city of Rome, the heart of an empire that had endured for centuries, was reduced to a smouldering ruin. The majestic forum, where great orators had once held sway, now lay in shambles, its columns blackened by soot and its stones slick with blood. The grand villas and temples, once symbols of Rome's power and prosperity, were now nothing more than hollow shells, their former glory consumed by the flames of destruction. In the midst of this apocalyptic scene, the Visigoths reveled in their victory, their savage laughter ringing out amidst the crackling of the fires. They had brought the mighty Roman Empire to its knees, and now the spoils of war were theirs for the taking. The survivors of the onslaught could only watch in numb disbelief as their world crumbled around them. The once unassailable bastion of civilization reduced to a nightmare of smoke, blood, and ruin. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled, its citizens faced a profound shift in their way of life. The once thriving cities that had been the heart of Roman civilization began to decay. Aqueducts fell into disrepair, leaving people without a reliable source of clean water. Roads that had connected the vast empire deteriorated, making travel and trade increasingly difficult. The grand public buildings and temples that had stood as symbols of Rome's power and prestige now lay in ruins, a haunting reminder of a glorious past that would never return. For the average Roman citizen, daily life became a struggle for survival. With the collapse of the economy, and the breakdown of social order, many were left without work or a stable source of income. Some turned to farming in a desperate attempt to feed their families, while others resorted to begging or thievery. The once vibrant markets and shops that had filled the cities grew quiet, their shelves bare and their owners long gone. As the empire fragmented, so too did the sense of unity and purpose that had once bound its people together. Romans who had taken great pride in their citizenship and their place in the world now found themselves adrift, uncertain of their identity and their future. Some clung to the old ways, hoping against hope that the empire might somehow be restored to its former glory. Others embraced the new reality, seeking to forge a new path in a world that had been forever changed. The psychological impact of Rome's fall was profound and far-reaching. For generations, Romans had believed that their empire was eternal, that it would endure for all time. To see it crumble before their eyes was a shock from which many never fully recovered. Some fell into despair, unable to imagine a world without the certainty and stability that Rome had once provided. Others turned to religion, seeking solace and meaning in the face of an uncertain future. Yet even in the midst of this darkness, there were glimmers of hope. The Roman people had always been resilient, and they would need every ounce of that resilience in the years to come. As the old world died away, a new one was being born. A world in which the legacy of Rome would live on, even as the empire itself faded into memory. It would be a long and difficult journey, but the Roman people would endure, as they always had, and in time, they would find their way forward into a new and uncharted future. As the Visigoths breached the city walls, panic swept through the streets of Rome like a raging wildfire. Amid the chaos, a noble Roman family huddled together in their lavish domus, the sounds of destruction growing ever closer. Quintus, the family patriarch, had seen the warning signs for years: the weakening of the legions, the crumbling economy, the corrupt politicians, but even he couldn't have predicted the sheer brutality of the sack. His wife, Claudia, clutched their two young children close to her chest, whispering prayers to the gods for protection. The family's loyal slaves bustled about, hastily packing valuables and provisions, unsure of what fate awaited them all. Quintus had always prided himself on his lineage, tracing his ancestors back to the days of the Republic. But now, as the screams of his fellow Romans echoed through the streets, he realized that blood meant little in the face of such unrelenting barbarism. As the Visigoths drew nearer, Quintus made a decision. He ordered his family and slaves to gather only what they could carry and to flee the city under the cover of darkness. It pained him to abandon the home that had been in his family for generations, the beautifully frescoed walls and the meticulously tended gardens. But he knew that their lives were far more precious than any material possessions. The family slipped out into the night, their hearts heavy with the weight of uncertainty. They joined the throngs of other Romans desperately seeking escape, the once proud citizens reduced to mere refugees in their own homeland. Quintus couldn't help but think of the mighty emperors of old, the ones who had expanded Rome's reach to the far corners of the known world. What would they think, he wondered, if they could see their beloved city now, brought to its knees by the very barbarians it had once conquered? As they made their way through the winding streets, the family witnessed scenes of unspeakable horror. The Visigoths showed no mercy, slaughtering men, women, and children alike, their swords and axes glinting in the flickering light of the burning buildings. Quintus shielded his children's eyes, trying to spare them from the worst of the carnage. But he knew that the memories of this night would haunt them all for years to come. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the family reached the city gates. They joined the mass exodus of Romans fleeing into the countryside, their once proud city now little more than a smouldering ruin behind them. As they walked, Quintus couldn't shake the feeling that this was the end of an era, that the Rome he had known and loved was gone forever. He glanced back one last time, his eyes filled with tears, before turning his face towards an uncertain future, one in which the mighty Roman Empire was no longer the master of the known world. As the Western Roman Empire entered its twilight years following the sack of Rome in 410 AD, life continued on for its citizens, though marked by a pervasive sense of uncertainty and change. The Eternal City, once the vibrant heart of a vast empire, now lay battered and bruised, a shadow of its former glory. Yet, amidst the rubble and the chaos, the resilient spirit of the Roman people endured. In the aftermath of Alaric's conquest, many Romans found themselves grappling with a profound sense of loss and disillusionment. The unthinkable had happened. The great city of Rome, the Caput Mundi, or head of the world, had fallen to barbarian invaders. This shattered the long-held belief in the invincibility and permanence of the Roman Empire. As news of the sack spread across the provinces, it sent shockwaves through the populace, eroding confidence in the once mighty imperial government. Despite the psychological blow, daily life in the Western Empire trudged forward. Farmers tended to their fields, artisans plied their trades, and merchants continued to ply the Mediterranean trade routes, albeit with a wary eye on the horizon. The rhythms of life, the cycles of planting and harvest, the exchanges in marketplaces and forums, remained the backbone of society, even as the political landscape shifted beneath their feet. However, the sack of Rome had accelerated the ongoing process of decentralization and localization in the Western Empire. With the central government weakened and imperial authority diminished, power increasingly devolved to regional leaders and local magnates. In the provinces, a patchwork of Roman governors, military commanders, and barbarian chieftains vied for control, carving out their own spheres of influence. This fragmentation made life more unpredictable and subject to the whims of local power struggles. For the average Roman citizen, this decentralization meant a greater reliance on local communities and social networks. In an age of instability, family ties, patronage relationships, and religious affiliations took on heightened importance. The bonds of kinship and the support of one's community provided a measure of security and continuity in the face of an uncertain future. The sack of Rome also had profound religious and philosophical implications. To many Romans, the fall of the city seemed to challenge the very foundations of their worldview. Pagans and Christians alike grappled with the meaning of Rome's humiliation. Some saw it as divine punishment for the empire's sins, while others interpreted it as a sign of the coming apocalypse. The sack fueled a sense of existential crisis and a search for spiritual solace in an increasingly chaotic world. Amidst this turmoil, the rise of Christianity continued apace. The sack of Rome, rather than undermining the new faith, actually served to strengthen it in some ways. Many Romans found comfort and hope in the Christian message of salvation and eternal life. The Church, with its extensive network of bishops, priests, and monasteries, provided a source of stability and social services in a time of upheaval. Christianity offered a unifying force that transcended political boundaries and ethnic divisions. Yet, even as the Church grew in influence, the old ways persisted. Pagan traditions, festivals, and beliefs remained deeply entrenched in the fabric of daily life. Many Romans, especially in the countryside, continued to honor the old gods alongside the new Christian deity. This religious syncretism reflected the complex and evolving spiritual landscape of the late Western Empire. As the 5th century unfolded, the Western Empire continued its gradual unraveling. The imperial government, beset by internal strife, economic woes, and external threats, struggled to maintain control over its vast territories. Barbarian kingdoms, such as those of the Visigoths, Vandals, and Franks, carved out their own domains within the crumbling edifice of the empire. The line between Roman and barbarian became increasingly blurred as these groups intermingled and intermarried. Through it all, the Roman people adapted and persevered. They clung to their ancient traditions even as they embraced new realities. They found solace in faith, family, and community in an age of uncertainty. The fall of Rome was not a single cataclysmic event, but a gradual process of transformation and resilience in the face of adversity. Life went on, even as the once mighty empire faded into the mists of history. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled into ruin, the surviving Romans did their best to pick up the pieces and rebuild their once great civilization. It was a daunting task, to be sure. The magnificent cities that had been the jewels of the empire now lay in various states of destruction and disrepair. The grand Roman road system, the very circulatory system of the empire, had deteriorated after years of neglect and warfare. Trade routes were disrupted, and the economy was in shambles. But the Romans were nothing if not resilient. They had bounced back from setbacks many times before in their long history. Slowly but surely, they began the arduous process of recovery and reconstruction. In the cities, rubble was cleared away, and new, more modest buildings rose from the ashes of the old. The aqueducts and other vital infrastructure were repaired, as well as could be managed with limited resources. In the countryside, farmers returned to their fields, many of which had been abandoned or destroyed during the chaos. They planted new crops and worked to restore agricultural productivity, knowing that a stable food supply would be crucial for the survival and regrowth of Roman society. Artisans and craftsmen, too, set about practicing their trades once more, creating the everyday items needed to sustain life and perhaps recapture a glimmer of Rome's former glory. The attempt to rebuild was not just physical, but also social and political. With the collapse of centralized authority, local leaders and communities had to step up and fill the void. They worked to maintain order, dispense justice, and provide for the common defense as best they could. The Christian Church also played an increasingly important role, offering spiritual guidance and material aid to the struggling populace. It was a time of trial and hardship, to be sure. The road to recovery was long and fraught with setbacks. Progress was slow, and life was far from easy. Many of the achievements and comforts of the past were now but distant memories. Yet through it all, the Romans persevered with the tenacity and determination that had made them great in the first place. Though their world had changed irrevocably, they adapted and carried on, rebuilding both their cities and their lives in the face of adversity. As the Western Roman Empire entered its twilight years in the 5th century AD, the once ironclad political and military control emanating from the capital city began to falter and fade. The emperors in Rome found their grip on power weakening with each passing year, as did their ability to project military might across the far-flung reaches of the empire. Distant frontier provinces that had long relied on the protection of the Roman legions increasingly found themselves left to their own devices. The formidable Roman armies, which had for centuries defended the empire's borders against barbarian incursions, were gradually withdrawn or disbanded as the imperial coffers ran dry and political will waned. This left many outlying regions vulnerable to attack and invasion, by the very tribal peoples the legions had once held at bay. Goths, Vandals, Franks, and other groups sensed the empire's vulnerability and pressed at its weakening defences, carving out their own kingdoms from Roman lands. Back in Rome and other major cities, the decline of central authority manifested in a breakdown of law and order. The once omnipresent Roman bureaucracy, which had efficiently administered the empire at its height, grew increasingly dysfunctional and corrupt. Basic services faltered, infrastructure crumbled, and the old Roman aristocracy fell into infighting as each vied for wealth and influence. Amid the chaos, for the average Roman citizen, this erosion of political stability and military protection from the capital meant a future that seemed ever more uncertain. The Pax Romana that had ensured centuries of relative peace and prosperity was quickly becoming a fading memory. In its place loomed an unsettling new reality in which banditry, famine, disease, and the depredations of foreign invaders became all too commonplace. As the empire fragmented politically and its borders dissolved, many Romans found themselves living in a world that would have been unrecognizable to their forebears. The old verities and assumptions were crumbling away, and the once unassailable idea of Rome's eternal greatness was increasingly relegated to a fast receding past. In this new age of uncertainty, self-reliance and localized power structures filled the void left by the diminishing reach of the imperial capital. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled, its cultural and religious foundations were also shifting. One of the most significant changes was the rise of Christianity, which would come to dominate the spiritual landscape of Europe for centuries to come. Christianity had begun as a small persecuted sect in the early days of the Roman Empire, but by the 4th century, it had grown to become the official religion of the state. The Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity in 312 AD was a turning point. He legalized the religion and even sponsored the construction of grand churches like the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. As Christianity spread, it began to replace the traditional Roman pantheon of gods. The old temples fell into disuse or were converted into churches. Pagan festivals were supplanted by Christian holy days. Even the Roman aristocracy, once staunch defenders of the old ways, began to embrace the new faith. But this religious transformation was not without conflict. The rise of powerful bishops and competing doctrinal views led to heated theological debates and even occasional violence. Heretical sects like the Arians and the Donatists challenged orthodox beliefs and vied for supremacy. Amidst this turmoil, however, Christianity also provided a sense of unity and continuity as the political structures of the Western Empire collapsed. The Church became a source of stability, offering spiritual comfort, social services, and even political leadership in some cases. Monks and nuns, living in isolated monasteries, preserved classical learning, and kept the flame of literacy alive during the coming Dark Ages. The cultural impact of Christianity extended beyond the religious sphere. Christian values and themes began to permeate art, literature, and music. The Church commissioned grand works of architecture and sponsored the production of illuminated manuscripts. At the same time, classical learning and pagan philosophy were increasingly viewed through a Christian lens, leading to a unique synthesis of old and new ideas. As the Western Roman Empire breathed its last, the rise of Christianity represented a profound shift in the cultural and religious landscape. It was a transformation that would shape the course of European history for centuries to come, even as the political and social structures of the ancient world crumbled into dust. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled, life became increasingly difficult for the average citizen. The experience of one Roman tradesman exemplifies the challenges faced by many during this tumultuous period. Marcus Valerius Priscus was a skilled metalworker living in a modest apartment above his workshop in the heart of Rome. For years, he had made a decent living crafting intricate bronze and silver goods for wealthy patrons. But as political instability grew and the economy faltered, Marcus found his once thriving business struggling to stay afloat. With trade routes disrupted and the value of currency fluctuating wildly, the cost of raw materials soared. Marcus was forced to raise his prices, but few could afford his wares. The aristocrats who had once been his best customers were now more concerned with funding their private armies or fleeing to their country estates than purchasing decorative metalwork. Marcus's savings dwindled as he dipped into them to cover his expenses and care for his family. As if the financial strain wasn't enough, daily life in Rome had become increasingly perilous. With the city's infrastructure crumbling and the government unable to maintain order, crime ran rampant. Marcus had to be constantly on guard against thieves and looters who targeted the dwindling number of businesses like his that still had valuable goods. He took to sleeping in his workshop with a sword by his side, ever vigilant. Despite the hardships, Marcus persevered. He adapted his craft, focusing on practical items like kitchen utensils and tools that people still needed, even in hard times. He bartered his skills for food and other essentials when coin was scarce. And he found solace in the support of his fellow tradesmen who banded together to protect one another and share resources. Marcus's story was not unique. Across the Western Empire, artisans, merchants, and laborers faced similar challenges as the world they knew crumbled around them. They endured not only economic hardship, but also the psychological toll of watching their once great civilization slowly decay. Yet, in the face of adversity, many like Marcus found the resilience to carry on, their determination a testament to the indomitable human spirit that would help society eventually rebuild from the ashes of Rome. As the Western Roman Empire entered its final century, the disintegration of Roman authority became increasingly apparent. The once mighty empire, which had held sway over much of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, found itself beset by a myriad of challenges that chipped away at its power and prestige. One of the most significant factors in this decline was the growing weakness of the central government in Rome. Emperors during this period were often short-lived, with many falling victim to assassination, usurpation, or military defeat. This constant turnover at the top made it difficult for any one ruler to effectively govern the vast empire and address the many problems it faced. The lack of strong, stable leadership was exacerbated by the increasing power of regional commanders and officials. As the central government's authority waned, these local leaders began to fill the void, often prioritizing their own interests over those of the empire as a whole. This led to a fragmentation of power, with various regions and provinces operating semi-autonomously, further weakening the cohesion of the empire. Economic troubles also played a significant role in the disintegration of Roman authority. The empire's once robust economy had been strained by years of overtaxation, inflation, and a decline in trade due to instability and foreign invasions. The debasement of Roman currency, a practice used by emperors to finance their military campaigns and lavish spending, led to rampant inflation and a loss of confidence in the monetary system. As economic conditions deteriorated, so too did the living standards of the Roman populace. Many citizens found themselves struggling to make ends meet, leading to widespread poverty and discontent. This, in turn, fueled unrest and rebellion, as people lost faith in the ability of the imperial government to provide. for their needs and ensure their well-being. The weakening of Roman authority was also evident in the empire's inability to effectively defend its borders. As the Western Empire's military strength diminished, it became increasingly vulnerable to invasions by neighboring tribes and kingdoms. The once formidable Roman legions, which had conquered and held vast territories for centuries, were now stretched thin and often unable to repel the incursions of the Germanic tribes, the Huns, and other external threats. The failure to secure the frontiers had far-reaching consequences for the empire. Not only did it lead to the loss of territory and resources, but it also contributed to a sense of insecurity and fear among the populace. As news of barbarian raids and conquests spread, many Romans began to lose confidence in the ability of the imperial government to protect them, further eroding the authority of the state. In addition to these external pressures, the Western Roman Empire also faced significant internal challenges. Religious tensions, particularly between Christians and pagans, as well as doctrinal disputes within the Christian church itself, often led to social and political divisions. These conflicts not only undermined the unity of the empire, but also diverted attention and resources away from addressing the more pressing issues of governance and defense. As the Western Empire entered its final decades, the disintegration of Roman authority had become all but irreversible. The once mighty civilization, which had dominated the Mediterranean world for centuries, was now a shadow of its former self. The central government in Rome, weakened by political instability, economic troubles, and military defeats, found itself increasingly unable to assert its control over the far-flung reaches of the empire. In the end, the fall of the Western Roman Empire was not the result of a single, catastrophic event, but rather the culmination of a long process of decline and disintegration. The gradual erosion of Roman authority, driven by a complex interplay of political, economic, military, and social factors, had left the once great empire vulnerable to the forces that would ultimately bring about its demise. As the last emperors of the West clung to their thrones, the world around them was changing rapidly. The old order, which had seemed so secure and enduring for centuries, was crumbling, giving way to a new era of uncertainty and transformation for the people living. Through these tumultuous times, the disintegration of Roman authority was not just a political or military reality, but a profound and deeply felt experience that would shape the course of their lives and the future of the Western world. As the Western Roman Empire continued its inexorable decline, the once mighty civilization lost more and more of its territory to encroaching barbarian kingdoms. Lands that had been under Roman control for centuries fell like dominoes, piece by piece, into the hands of various Germanic tribes. The Visigoths, who had famously sacked Rome itself in 410 AD, came to control much of Hispania, the Roman province that would later become Spain and Portugal. Under their king Euric, who ruled from 466 to 484, the Visigoths expanded their holdings into Gaul, seizing most of the region of Aquitaine in the southwest of modern France. To the north, the Franks, who would eventually establish the powerful Merovingian dynasty, conquered the Roman province of Gaul. Led by their legendary king Clovis I in the late 5th century, the Franks defeated the last Roman armies in Gaul and united the territory under their rule. This marked the beginning of what would evolve into the Kingdom of France. Across the Channel in Britain, which had been part of the Roman Empire since the 1st century AD, the legions had withdrawn around 410 to focus on protecting Rome itself. In the ensuing power vacuum, the Romano-British leaders struggled to fend off invasions by the Picts and Scots. According to legend, they invited the Germanic Angles and Saxons as mercenaries to help defend the island, But these tribes soon established their own kingdoms. Thus began the gradual transformation of Britannia into England, named after the Angles. In North Africa, the Vandals seized control from the Romans in the early 5th century. They established a powerful kingdom centered on the city of Carthage, once Rome's great rival, and even invaded Italy, sacking Rome in 455 AD. As these and other barbarian kingdoms chipped away at the Western Empire, the Roman borders that had held strong for so long crumbled. The empire lost its most productive lands, the breadbaskets of North Africa, the rich fields of Gaul, the mineral wealth of Hispania and Britannia. Cut off from these vital resources, the city of Rome itself began to wither. Its population, which had peaked at over 1 million during the height of the empire, dwindled to a mere few tens of thousands for the average Roman. Citizen living through these tumultuous times, the world must have seemed to be turning upside down. The once unassailable empire, which had brought peace, prosperity, and stability for centuries, was unraveling before their eyes. The future was uncertain as the glory of Rome faded into memory, and the known world fragmented into a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms. It was truly the end of an era and the beginning of a new uncharted chapter in the history of Western civilization. As the Western Roman Empire entered its twilight years in the early 5th century AD, its once formidable military, the backbone of Roman power and prestige for centuries, found itself in a precarious state. The mighty legions that had conquered vast swathes of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East were now but a shadow of their former selves. Centuries of war, coupled with increasing political instability and economic turmoil, had taken a heavy toll on the Roman army's strength and morale. In the past, serving in the legions was considered a great honor and a path to citizenship and social advancement. But as the empire began to crumble, the prestige and loyalty associated with military service waned. Many soldiers, particularly those stationed in distant frontier provinces, felt increasingly disconnected from the political machinations and infighting that plagued the imperial court in Rome. They saw little reason to risk their lives for an empire that seemed to be coming apart at the seams. Moreover, the once rigorous standards for recruitment and training had grown lax. In desperate need of manpower, the army began to rely more heavily on hiring foreign mercenaries, known as federati, to fill its ranks. While these warriors from beyond the empire's borders were often skilled fighters, they lacked the deep-seated loyalty and discipline that had defined the Roman legions of old. Many were more interested in the promise of plunder and personal gain than in defending the empire's interests. This decline in military strength and loyalty left the Western Roman Empire vulnerable to the increasing pressures it faced from all sides. The legions struggled to repel the incursions of barbarian tribes along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, while also contending with internal revolts and usurpations. In a vicious cycle, each military defeat and loss of territory further eroded the army's morale and cohesion, making it even more difficult to mount an effective defense of the empire. As the once indomitable legions grew weaker and less reliable, the Western Roman Empire's fate hung in the balance. The dwindling military strength and loyalty of the Roman army was a key factor in the empire's ultimate collapse, as it left Rome increasingly unable to protect its borders and maintain order within its vast territories. It was a far cry from the days when the mere sight of a Roman legion on the horizon was enough to strike fear into the hearts of Rome's enemies. Now, the legions were a mere flicker of their former glory, and the empire they had once defended so fiercely was slipping inexorably into the pages of history. As the Western Roman Empire entered its twilight years in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, the once mighty civilization found itself beset not only by external threats, but also by growing corruption and infighting among its ruling elites. The imperial court, the Senate, and the military leadership were increasingly gripped by power struggles, political intrigue, and personal rivalries that undermined the stability and effectiveness of the Roman state. Ambitious politicians and generals jockeyed for influence, often resorting to bribery, assassination, and outright civil war to advance their interests. The imperial throne itself became a prize to be fought over, with multiple claimants and usurpers vying for supremacy. In one particularly turbulent period between 235 and 284 AD, known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century, the empire saw no fewer than 26 different emperors, many of whom met violent ends at the hands of their rivals or their own soldiers. This constant turnover of leadership and the accompanying political chaos made it difficult for the empire to mount a coherent response to the many challenges it faced, from barbarian invasions to economic decline. Instead of working together to address these pressing issues, Roman elites were often more concerned with preserving their own power and wealth, even if it meant undermining the very foundations of the state they were supposed to serve. Corruption was rampant, with officials at all levels using their positions to enrich themselves and their allies. Tax collectors, in particular, were notorious for their greed and abuse of power, squeezing the populace for every last coin while lining their own pockets. This not only fueled resentment and unrest among the common people, but also starved the imperial treasury of much-needed revenue. Even the once proud Roman legions were not immune to the rot of corruption and infighting. As the empire's borders came under increasing pressure from barbarian incursions, many military leaders prioritized their own ambitions over the defense of the realm. Some even made secret deals with the very enemies they were supposed to be fighting, trading gold and land for temporary truces or personal gain. All of this internal strife and dysfunction severely weakened the Roman state, leaving it ill-equipped to deal with the many external threats it faced. As the empire's institutions crumbled from within, its enemies grew bolder and more numerous, sensing that the once mighty Roman civilization was now ripe for the taking. The stage was set for the final act in the long, slow decline of the Western Roman Empire, as corruption and infighting among its elites hastened its eventual fall. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled in the late 5th century CE, a young boy found himself at the center of momentous historical events. Romulus Augustus, known derisively as Romulus Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus, was born around 460 CE, the son of Orestes, a prominent Roman military commander. Through his father's machinations, Romulus was appointed as Western Roman Emperor in 475 CE, at the tender age of 14 or 15. The boy emperor's rule would prove to be short-lived. Orestes had refused to grant land to Odoacer and his Germanic foederati troops, who had been fighting for Rome as allies. Odoacer, himself a Germanic officer, rebelled against Orestes, capturing and executing him in August of 476. Soon after, Odoacer advanced on Ravenna, the capital and residence of the young Emperor Romulus. The city was swiftly captured, but in a surprise act of mercy, Odoacer spared the boy's life. On September 4th, 476 CE, Romulus Augustulus was formally deposed, becoming the last Western Roman emperor. In a letter to the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno, Odoacer portrayed his actions as merely removing a usurper, arguing there was no longer a need for a separate Western emperor. The deposed Romulus was sent to live in the Castellum Lucullanum, a fortress in Campania near Naples. There, he lived out his days in comfortable retirement on a generous pension provided by Odoacer. It was an unexpectedly peaceful fate in such a turbulent time. The story of Romulus Augustulus, the reluctant last emperor, marked the end of an era. His deposition formalized the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire, even as the Eastern Empire continued in Constantinople. A child caught up in. Sweeping historical forces, Romulus Augustulus represented the fading twilight of Roman rule in the West. His poignant tale reminds us of the human dramas, large and small, that played out amidst the tectonic shifts of empire and the slow, momentous fall of ancient Rome. As the Western Roman Empire limped into the 5th century AD, battered and bruised from centuries of turmoil, a new threat emerged from the East that would shake Rome to its very foundations. Attila the Hun, a name that would become synonymous with brutality and conquest, burst onto the scene with his nomadic warriors, leaving a trail of destruction across Europe that the weakened Roman defences struggled to withstand. Attila united the disparate Hunnic tribes under his banner in the early 430 AD, forging them into a formidable fighting force. From their seats of power on the Great Hungarian Plain, they launched devastating raids and invasions into the Balkans and Central Europe. The Eastern Roman Empire, ruled from Constantinople, frantically paid tribute to the Huns to keep them at bay. But like a pack of hungry wolves, the Huns always returned, demanding more. The Hunnic armies were the ultimate light cavalry, skilled bowmen who could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy from horseback. Their short composite bows outranged the Roman weapons, allowing the Huns to strike and retreat before the legionaries could mount an effective defense. Hunnic riders could cover vast distances quickly, appearing like ghosts on the horizon to pillage towns and farmlands before vanishing again, leaving smouldering ruins in their wake. In 451 AD, Attila turned his gaze to the Western Roman Empire, invading Gaul with a massive army said to number in the hundreds of thousands. The Romans, led by the capable general Flavius Aetius, cobbled together a defense alongside their former enemies, the Visigoths. At the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, Romans and Goths fought side by side against Attila's horde in a brutal melee. Though tactically inconclusive, the battle blunted Attila's momentum and prevented the complete collapse of Roman Gaul. Undeterred, Attila invaded Italy the following year, sacking and razing cities like Aquileia. The road to Rome itself lay open. According to legend, Pope Leo I met with Attila and convinced him to spare the city. The more likely reason was an outbreak of disease and famine within Attila's army, forcing him to withdraw. The Hunnic king died shortly after in 453 AD, and his empire swiftly crumbled, without his iron grip to hold it together. But Attila was merely the most famous of Rome's 5th century nemeses. Vandals, Alans, Goths, and other peoples continued to chip away at the Western Empire's borders, carving out their own kingdoms within lands that had been Roman for centuries. The Great Rhine frontier, once the pinnacle of Roman military engineering, collapsed as Germanic warriors flooded across the river, setting up autonomous fiefdoms with or without imperial approval. To the average Roman citizen, it must have felt like the world was ending. The Eternal City, the Caput Mundi, was no longer the master of its own destiny. Emperors came and went, little more than puppets dancing to the tune of barbarian strongmen. In 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, sacked Rome itself. Though more of a symbolic blow than a mortal one, The sack shattered the veneer of Rome's invincibility. If the great city on the Tiber could fall, what hope was there for the rest of the empire? As the 5th century wore on, the barbarians tightened their stranglehold on the Western Empire's throat. Ricimer, a half-Suebian, half-Visigothic general, became the power behind the throne, deposing and installing emperors at will. The Vandals seized North Africa, the empire's breadbasket, disrupting the flow of grain and trade that kept the Roman population fed. Slowly but surely, the imperial territory shrank until little more than Italy itself remained under nominal Roman control. For those living through these dark times, the future must have seemed bleak and uncertain. The old ways were crumbling, and the new world order had yet to take shape. But even as the Western Empire gasped its last breaths, the seeds of new civilizations and cultures were being planted in the fertile soil of its decaying corpse. The barbarians who toppled Rome would, in time, lay the foundations for the medieval kingdoms of Europe, blending Germanic, Hunnic, and Roman influences into something altogether new. But those who witnessed the fall firsthand could scarcely have imagined what would rise from the ashes of their once great empire. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled, the Huns were building a fierce and fearsome reputation on the outskirts of civilization. These nomadic warriors, hailing from the steppes of Central Asia, had begun their westward expansion in the late 4th century. The Huns were known for their exceptional horsemanship and archery skills, honed from a young age as they traversed the vast grasslands. They could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop, a tactic that struck terror into the hearts of their enemies. Roman chroniclers describe the Huns as savage and uncivilized, with a ruthless and bloodthirsty nature. The Hunnic warriors were also renowned for their distinctive appearance. They wore their hair in long braids and sported beards, a stark contrast to the clean-shaven Romans. Their faces, according to ancient accounts, were scarred from self-inflicted wounds, a practice believed to prevent beard growth and enhance their intimidating visage. As the Huns pushed further into Europe, they left a trail of destruction in their wake. They plundered villages, burned crops, and slaughtered those who dared to resist. The mere mention of their name was enough to send people fleeing in fear. Even the mighty Roman legions, once the most formidable fighting force in the world, trembled at the prospect of facing the Huns in battle. The Huns' reputation was further cemented by their leader, Attila, who rose to power in the mid-5th century. Known as the Scourge of God, Attila was a brilliant military strategist and a charismatic leader who united the Hunnic tribes under his banner. His campaigns against the Eastern and Western Roman empires were legendary, and his name became synonymous with terror and destruction. As the Western Roman Empire teetered on the brink of collapse, the Huns' fierce and fearsome reputation only grew. The once mighty Roman army, weakened by internal strife and depleted resources, struggled to contain the Hunnic threat. The fear of the Huns permeated every level of Roman society, from the common people to the highest echelons of power. In the end, the Huns' impact on the fall of Rome was significant, even if they did not directly cause its demise. Their relentless attacks and the fear they instilled in the Roman populace contributed to the overall instability and decline of the Western Empire. The fierce and fearsome reputation of the Huns had left an indelible mark on the pages of history, forever intertwined with the story of Rome's fall. As the Western Roman Empire continued its descent into chaos and collapse in the 5th century AD, a new threat emerged from the east that would terrorize Europe and accelerate Rome's demise. Attila the Hun, known to the Romans as the Scourge of God, burst onto the scene leading a vast army of nomadic warriors, on a campaign of destruction across the continent. Attila united the disparate Hunnic tribes of the Eurasian steppe into a formidable fighting force, held together by his dominant personality and military prowess. He and his violent raiders thundered across the land on horseback, striking fear into the hearts of Romans and barbarians alike. With terrifying speed, the Huns could appear like a sudden storm, leaving a trail of burned villages, slaughtered inhabitants, and scorched earth in their wake. The Huns had little interest in conquest or colonization. Their primary aim was to extract gold, grain, and other wealth from their victims through brutality and blackmail. Attila was a master extortionist, forcing the Eastern Roman Empire to pay staggering annual tributes to avoid his ruinous attacks. Those who resisted his demands faced the wrath of his barbarian horde. In the 440 SAD, Attila invaded the Balkans, crushing Roman armies and sacking great cities. The Eastern Roman capital of Constantinople only narrowly escaped destruction thanks to its mighty Theodosian walls. Attila then turned his attention westward, leading his marauders on a rampage of looting and carnage through Gaul, Hispania, and Italy. The Romans struggled to muster an effective defense against this elusive enemy. The Hunnic cavalry's high mobility and unconventional tactics confounded the slow, bulky Roman legions designed for traditional battles. Attila's psychological warfare was equally devastating, his mere presence on the horizon enough to send people fleeing in panic. Attila plundered the countryside and put great cities like Aquileia to the torch, but he spared Rome itself. According to legend, Pope Leo I met with Attila and convinced him to turn back. More likely, Attila's army was depleted by disease and stretched too thin to mount a prolonged siege of Rome's formidable defences. Nonetheless, the Huns left Italy laden with riches and tens of thousands of Roman captives, doomed to slavery. Though Attila died suddenly in 453 AD, the damage was done. His onslaught severely weakened an already fragile Western Roman Empire, draining its coffers, devastating its land and people, and accelerating its ultimate unraveling. The sheer terror Attila instilled lingered for centuries, immortalized in Roman chronicles and Germanic sagas, a haunting memory of the merciless warlord who brought a once great empire to its knees. As the Western Roman Empire teetered on the brink of collapse in the 5th century AD, its leaders made increasingly desperate attempts at diplomacy and appeasement to stave off the seemingly inevitable. With barbarian tribes pressing in from all sides and the once mighty legions stretched thin, Rome turned to negotiation and compromise in a bid to buy itself some precious time. In a humbling reversal of fortune, the same empire that had once conquered and subjugated so much of the known world now found itself trying to bargain with the very peoples it had long considered beneath it. Envoys were sent out bearing lavish gifts and promises of tribute, as Rome sought to convince the barbarians to spare its cities and citizens from the ravages of invasion. But such measures were often little more than stopgaps, and the concessions Rome was forced to make only seemed to embolden its enemies further. In some cases, the empire even resorted to outright bribery, paying off barbarian leaders with gold and silver in exchange for temporary peace. It was a far cry from the days when Rome had dictated terms to the rest of the world, and a stark reminder of just how far the once great empire had fallen. Of course, not all of Rome's diplomatic efforts were so ignominious. There were still those among the empire's leaders who sought to negotiate from a position of strength, using a combination of flattery, threats, and appeals to mutual interest to keep the barbarians at bay. But as the years wore on and the empire's plight grew ever more dire, such voices became fewer and further between. In the end, no amount of diplomacy or appeasement could save the Western Roman Empire from its ultimate fate. The rot had simply run too deep, and the forces arrayed against it had grown too strong. But for a brief moment in history, as the world they had known crumbled around them, the people of Rome clung to the hope that somehow, through some last-ditch effort at negotiation, they might yet stave off the darkness a little while longer. As tensions mounted between the Romans and the Huns, a Roman diplomat by the name of Priscus found himself on a perilous mission to negotiate with the infamous Attila the Hun. In the year 449 AD, Priscus set out from Constantinople as part of an embassy to Attila's court, located somewhere on the Great Hungarian Plain. The journey was long and arduous, taking the diplomatic party through treacherous terrain and hostile territories. After weeks of travel, Priscus and his companions finally arrived at Attila's sprawling compound, a vast network of wooden buildings and tents that seemed to stretch on forever. They were greeted by a dizzying array of sights, sounds, and smells. The clamour of blacksmiths at work, the aroma of roasting meats, and the chatter of people from all corners of Attila's empire. Priscus was ushered into Attila's presence, where he found himself face to face with the man who had become the scourge of the Roman world. Attila was not the barbarian brute that Priscus had expected, but rather a shrewd and calculating leader who knew how to wield his power. The two men engaged in a delicate dance of diplomacy, each trying to gain the upper hand without pushing the other too far. Over the course of several days, Priscus attended lavish banquets and witnessed firsthand the complex workings of Attila's court. He marveled at the way Attila managed to hold together such a vast and diverse empire, with people from dozens of different tribes and cultures all coexisting under his rule. But even as he admired Attila's political savvy, Priscus could not shake the sense of unease that hung over the negotiations. He knew that the fate of the Roman Empire hung in the balance, and that one false move could lead to disaster. In the end, Priscus was able to secure a fragile peace with Attila, but he knew that it would not last forever. As he made the long journey back to Constantinople, he could not help but wonder what the future held for Rome, and whether it would be able to withstand the gathering storm that was Attila and his Huns. As the Roman Empire began its slow decline, life for its citizens took on a new character, shaped by the crumbling institutions that had once provided stability and order. In the cities, the grand public works and monuments that had been the pride of earlier generations now often sat in disrepair, a silent testament to the fading glory of Rome. The forums where citizens had gathered to debate and socialize grew quieter as people retreated into their private lives, unsure of what the future held. For the wealthy, life went on much as it always had, albeit with a growing sense of unease. They still held lavish banquets in their sprawling villas, reclining on plush couches as servants attended to their every need. But now, the conversations were tinged with worry, as news of barbarian incursions and political turmoil filtered in from the far reaches of the empire. Some began to flee to their country estates, hoping to wait out the storm in the relative safety and comfort of their rural retreats. The middle class, once the backbone of Roman society, found themselves increasingly squeezed by the economic pressures of the time. Artisans and shopkeepers struggled to make ends meet as trade routes were disrupted and the value of currency fluctuated wildly. Many were forced to abandon their trades and seek employment in the households of the rich, or even to sell themselves into slavery to escape poverty. For the poor, life had always been a struggle, but the crumbling of the empire only made their lot harder. With the breakdown of the Annona, the system that had once ensured a steady supply of grain to the cities, food shortages became more common. The poor crowded into squalid insulae, the multi-story tenements that packed the poorer quarters of Rome and other cities, living in cramped, unsanitary conditions. Disease was rampant, and infant mortality skyrocketed. In the countryside, the once prosperous villas that had dotted the landscape fell into decay as their owners abandoned them for the relative safety of the cities. Fields lay fallow, and the great aqueducts that had irrigated the land fell into disrepair. Peasants eked out a meagre existence, burdened by heavy taxes and the constant threat of marauding bandits and invaders. Yet even in these dark times, life went on. Children played in the streets, their laughter echoing through the alleyways. Lovers met in secret, stealing moments of joy amid the uncertainty. Families gathered around the hearth to share meals and stories, finding comfort in the bonds of kinship. In the marketplaces, merchants still hawked their wares, their voices rising above the din of the crowds. People still gathered in the public baths, soaking in the steamy water and gossiping about the latest news. In the amphitheatres, gladiators still fought and died for the entertainment of the masses, though the spectacles were fewer and less grand than in years past. Religion took on new importance in this time of upheaval, as people sought solace and meaning in the face of an uncertain future. Christianity, once a small, persecuted sect, began to gain traction, offering a message of hope and salvation that resonated with many. Pagan cults also flourished as people turned to the old gods in a desperate attempt to stave off the chaos that seemed to be engulfing the world. As the empire crumbled around them, the people of Rome clung to what they knew, to the rhythms and routines of daily life that had sustained them for generations. They adapted as best they could to the changing times, finding small joys and moments of normalcy amid the tumult. And though the future was uncertain, they faced it with the same resilience and determination that had always been the hallmark of the Roman people. Life during the fall of Rome was a study in contrasts, a time of decay and decline, but also of endurance and adaptation. It was a world where the old certainties were crumbling, but where new possibilities were beginning to emerge. And through it all, the people endured, their lives a testament to the indomitable spirit of humanity in the face of even the greatest challenges. As the Western Roman Empire spiraled into decline, its once impressive infrastructure began to crumble and decay. The vast network of roads that had enabled the swift movement of troops, goods, and information across the empire fell into disrepair. With dwindling funds and manpower, the maintenance of these vital arteries became increasingly difficult. Potholes and cracks marred the once smooth surfaces, making travel more arduous and time-consuming. Bridges that had stood for centuries began to collapse, severing important trade routes and isolating communities. The aqueducts, marvels of Roman engineering that had supplied cities with fresh water, also suffered from neglect. Leaks sprung from the aging pipelines, and sections of the elevated channels crumbled away. In some cases, desperate citizens resorted to stripping lead from the aqueducts to fashion into other goods, further compromising the integrity of the water supply systems. As the flow of clean water diminished, sanitation in the cities deteriorated, leading to the spread of disease and a decline in public health. The degradation of infrastructure had far-reaching consequences for the people living in the waning days of the Western Roman Empire. Farmers struggled to transport their crops to market, leading to food shortages in urban areas. Merchants faced longer and more perilous journeys, driving up the cost of goods. Communication between different regions became more difficult, weakening the cohesion of the empire. The once mighty Roman army, which had relied on the road network for quick deployment, found its mobility severely hampered. As the infrastructure crumbled, so too did the sense of unity and purpose that had held the empire together. The declining state of roads and aqueducts served as a tangible reminder of Rome's fading glory, a symbol of the unraveling of a once great civilization. For the average Roman citizen, life became more challenging and uncertain as the familiar comforts and conveniences they had long taken for granted slowly eroded away, mirroring the gradual disintegration of the Western Roman Empire itself. As the Western Roman Empire continued its gradual decline, everyday life became increasingly difficult for the average Roman citizen. The once thriving economy and extensive trade networks that had brought prosperity to the empire for centuries began to contract and fray. Merchants found it more and more challenging to safely transport their goods along roads and trade routes that were now plagued by bandits and invading tribes. The reduced flow of goods and resources led to shortages and rising prices in many Roman cities and towns. With the economy in a state of deterioration, poverty became more widespread. Many farmers, artisans, and laborers struggled to make ends meet as demand for their goods and services dwindled. Some were forced to abandon their trades altogether, seeking employment as hired hands or even resorting to begging in the streets. In the countryside, small farmers often found themselves unable to compete with the large, wealthy estates that dominated agricultural production. These struggling farmers frequently had no choice but to sell their land and become tenant farmers or migrate to the cities in search of work. The once vibrant urban centers of the Roman Empire were not immune to the economic downturn. As trade and commerce slowed, many businesses shuttered their doors, leaving behind empty storefronts and unemployed workers. The city's poorer districts became increasingly overcrowded as more people from the countryside poured in, hoping to find a better life. However, with limited opportunities and resources, these urban poor often found themselves living in squalid conditions, relying on the charity of the wealthy or the increasingly overburdened state welfare system. As poverty spread and the gap between rich and poor widened, social unrest began to simmer beneath the surface of Roman society. Desperate people sometimes turned to crime, joining gangs of thieves, or even forming mobs to loot and riot during times of extreme hardship. The government, already strained by the costs of defending the empire and maintaining order, found it increasingly difficult to address the needs of its most vulnerable citizens. This growing inequality and instability further weakened the foundations of the once mighty Roman Empire, contributing to its eventual collapse in the West. As Christianity continued to spread and gain influence throughout the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries, it increasingly came into conflict with the traditional pagan religions that had long been practiced in Rome. These clashes between paganism and Christianity played out in both the religious and political spheres, contributing to the growing instability during the empire's gradual decline and fall. For centuries, Roman religious life had centered around the worship of a pantheon of gods and participation in various festivals, rituals, and sacrifices in their honor. But as Christian teachings took hold, these pagan practices came to be seen as idolatrous and incompatible with monotheistic Christian doctrine. Pagan temples were increasingly abandoned or destroyed, and fewer public resources were devoted to the upkeep of the old cultic infrastructure. This shift was accelerated by the policies of Christian emperors like Constantine I and Theodosius I, who actively promoted Christianity while enacting laws against pagan practices. The Theodosian decrees of the late 4th century essentially banned pagan worship altogether. Pagan holidays were replaced on the calendar by Christian ones, and even common activities like making sacrifices to the old Roman gods became punishable offences. Of course, not all Romans readily accepted these changes. Many aristocratic families in particular held on to their pagan traditions, whether out of genuine religious devotion, cultural conservatism, or as a form of protest against the growth of imperial Christianity. In some cases, prominent pagans were subjected to mob violence and persecution, not unlike what Christians themselves had experienced in earlier centuries. Ironically, some Christians adopted elements of pagan worship in the process of stamping it out, such as adapting pagan shrines and festivals to Christian purposes. Pope Gregory I, for instance, instructed missionaries to repurpose pagan temples as churches rather than destroying them. Over time, Christianity absorbed and transformed many aspects of Roman paganism, even while opposing it. Ultimately, the Christianization of the empire was a centuries-long process full of social upheaval and controversy. The clashes between paganism and Christianity divided communities, upended ancient traditions, and reshaped the religious landscape, all while the Roman Empire itself teetered on the brink of collapse. It marked a profound cultural and spiritual reorientation whose reverberations would long outlast the political rule of Rome. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled in the 5th century AD, life for the average peasant family in Gaul became increasingly difficult and unpredictable. They faced the daily struggle of eking out a meagre existence under the looming shadow of barbarian invasions and the gradual collapse of Roman authority. One such family lived in a small one-room hut on the outskirts of a once thriving Roman villa. The father, Marcellus, toiled from dawn to dusk in the fields, trying to coax enough wheat and vegetables from the tired soil to feed his wife and 3 young children. With each passing year, the harvests grew more uncertain as the roads and irrigation systems fell into disrepair without the guiding hand of Roman engineers. His wife, Livia, spent her days grinding grain into coarse flour, mending tattered clothes, and tending to their scrawny chickens, a far cry from the bustling markets and luxurious bathhouses that her grandmother spoke of from her youth. The children, too young to fully grasp the precariousness of their situation, played simple games with sticks and stones, blissfully unaware that their chance for education and a better life was slipping away with each passing day. News from the wider world was sporadic and often grim. Whispers reached their village of the great city of Rome itself being sacked by the Visigoths, and of entire provinces falling to the control of foreign kings. The last remaining threads of imperial administration were stretched thinner each year as tax collectors became a rare sight, and the once gleaming Roman roads grew choked with weeds. For Marcellus and his family, the grand machinations of empire and the movements of peoples were distant concerns next to the immediate needs of food, shelter, and safety. They clung to the ancient rhythms of planting and harvest, of sun and rain and soil, even as the world they had always known crumbled around them. There was no time for philosophy or art, only the daily struggle to survive in a land that was at once familiar and yet ever more foreign. As they huddled around their meager fire each night, listening to the distant howls of wolves and the rustling of the wind through the trees, Marcellus couldn't help but wonder what the future held for his children and their children. The Pax Romana, the centuries of peace and prosperity that had shaped. Their world had faded into memory. An uncertain path lay ahead, into a new world order that none could yet see clearly. But for now, they endured, day by day, season by season, holding fast to family and faith as the last light of Rome sputtered and dimmed on the horizon. As the Western Roman Empire entered its final centuries, the once glorious capital city of Rome was a shadow of its former self. The splendor and opulence that had defined the city at its height had given way to a more subdued and troubled existence. The grand marble temples and bustling forums now stood alongside crumbling aqueducts and abandoned neighborhoods. The city's population, which had swelled to over 1 million at its peak, had dwindled significantly as economic hardship, political instability, and the allure of safer havens drove many Romans away. Yet even in this diminished state, Rome remained a city of contrasts and contradictions. The wealthy elite still clung to their lavish lifestyles, hosting elaborate banquets in their sprawling villas and adorning themselves with expensive silk and glittering jewels. They sought solace in the pleasures of the moment, perhaps sensing that their world was slowly crumbling around them. The less fortunate, however, faced a daily struggle for survival. With the empire's trade networks disrupted and its agricultural base in decline, food shortages and rising prices became all too common. The once reliable system of grain distribution, which had long kept the city's poor fed, grew increasingly strained and sporadic. Despite the hardships, life in Rome trudged on. The city's markets still buzzed with activity, even if the goods on offer were less plentiful and more expensive than in years past. Artisans and craftsmen continued to ply their trades, creating the intricate mosaics, delicate glassware, and finely wrought metalwork for which Roman artisanship was renowned. The city's bathhouses, though fewer in number and less well maintained than before, remained popular gathering places where Romans could socialize, relax, and escape the pressures of daily life. Religion, too, played an increasingly important role in the lives of Romans during this period. Christianity, which had once been a small and persecuted sect, had grown to become the empire's official religion. The city was now dotted with churches and basilicas, many of them built on the foundations of older pagan temples. The church provided not only spiritual comfort but also practical support, with clergy in monasteries often stepping in to fill the gaps left by the declining imperial government. Yet even as Christianity solidified its hold on Roman society, the old pagan traditions refused to die out entirely. Many Romans, particularly those in the countryside, continued to observe the ancient festivals and make offerings to the old gods alongside their Christian worship. This blending of old and new, pagan and Christian, was a testament to the resilience and adaptability of Roman culture, even in the face of great change. As the empire's borders grew increasingly porous and its armies less able to defend against foreign incursions, the spectre of invasion loomed large in the minds of many Romans. The city's once mighty walls, which had stood for centuries as a symbol of Rome's invincibility, now seemed all too vulnerable. Stories of barbarian raids and the sacking of other Roman cities spread like wildfire, fueling a sense of unease and foreboding. Yet despite the many challenges they faced, the people of Rome clung to their identity as Romans. They took pride in their city's long history and rich cultural heritage, even as they watched the empire that had once seemed eternal slowly crumble around them. In the face of an uncertain future, they found solace in the familiar rhythms of daily life, in the bustle of the markets, the laughter of children at play, and the quiet moments of reflection in the city's churches and temples. As the sun set over the 7 hills of Rome, casting long shadows across the city's ancient streets and monuments, one could almost imagine the ghosts of Rome's glorious past mingling with its troubled present. The city that had once been the center of the world, the Caput Mundi, was now a mere flicker of its former self. Yet even in its decline, Rome remained a city of enduring fascination, a testament to the heights of human achievement and the inexorable march of history. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled, the once grand architecture and cultural institutions that had defined Roman life for centuries began to fade and decay. The magnificent temples, bathhouses, and amphitheatres that stood as testaments to Rome's power and prosperity now sat in disrepair, their marble facades cracked and crumbling, their intricate mosaics and frescoes slowly eroding away. The famous Roman roads, which had connected the vast empire and facilitated trade and communication, fell into neglect. Without regular maintenance, the stone-paved highways that had once been the envy of the world became overgrown with weeds and riddled with potholes, making travel increasingly difficult and dangerous. The great public works projects that had provided citizens with clean water, sanitation, and entertainment also suffered. The aqueducts, which had carried fresh water from distant springs into the heart of Rome's cities, began to leak and collapse, leaving many neighborhoods without a reliable water supply. The once bustling public baths, where Romans had gathered to socialize, relax, and conduct business, now stood empty and echoing, their heated pools gone cold. Even the majestic Roman Forum, the center of political and social life in the capital, lost much of its former glory. The grand basilicas and temples that had once housed the Senate and hosted important public events were now overshadowed by the crumbling ruins of abandoned buildings and the makeshift shelters of the city's growing population of the poor and displaced. As the empire's economy faltered and resources grew scarce, many of the cultural institutions that had flourished during Rome's golden age began to decline as well. The great libraries and schools that had preserved and transmitted classical knowledge saw their collections dwindle and their doors close. The patronage of the arts and sciences, once a source of pride for wealthy Romans, became an unaffordable luxury, and many talented artists, writers, and thinkers found themselves without support or an audience. Yet even as the physical remnants of Rome's past grandeur slowly crumbled, the cultural legacy of the empire endured. The ideas, values, and achievements of Roman civilization continued to shape the Western world long after the fall of Rome itself, influencing everything from language and law to art and architecture. And though the once mighty monuments of Rome's glory days now stood as mere shadows of their former selves, they remained a poignant reminder of the heights to which human ambition and ingenuity could soar, even in the face of inevitable decline and decay. As the Western Roman Empire continued its decline, the once thriving fields of education, arts, and urban society began to deteriorate as well. The grand public works projects and majestic monuments that had once been the pride of Rome fell into disrepair. Aqueducts that had supplied fresh water to the cities were neglected, leading to a decrease in sanitation and public health. The great Roman baths, which had served as social hubs and cultural centers, were abandoned as the cost of maintaining them became too high. The education system, which had produced some of the greatest minds in history, also suffered. Many wealthy families could no longer afford to send their children to school, and the quality of teaching declined as fewer resources were available. The study of Greek, once considered essential for any educated Roman, became less common as the empire's ties to the East weakened. The libraries that had housed vast collections of knowledge were no longer maintained, and many precious manuscripts were lost or destroyed. The arts, too, experienced a decline during this period. The once vibrant theatre scene, which had entertained and educated the masses, faded away as funding dried up and audiences dwindled. The intricate mosaics and frescoes that had adorned the walls of Roman villas and public buildings were no longer commissioned, and the skills required to create them were gradually lost. Sculptors and painters, who had once been highly sought after, found themselves without patrons as the wealthy elite focused their resources on more pressing matters. The decline of urban society was perhaps the most visible sign of Rome's fall. The bustling cities that had been the heart of the empire became shadows of their former selves. As trade routes were disrupted and the economy faltered, many people left the cities in search of better opportunities in the countryside. Those who remained faced increasing poverty and crime as the social fabric of urban life unraveled. The once grand public spaces, such as forums and amphitheatres, fell into disuse and decay, serving as stark reminders of Rome's fading glory. The decline of education, arts, and urban society during the fall of Rome was a gradual process, but its impact was profound. As these pillars of Roman civilization crumbled, so too did the sense of unity and purpose that had once held the empire together. The loss of these cultural touchstones left a void that would take centuries to fill, and the legacy of Rome's decline would be felt for generations to come. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled in the 5th century AD, life for its citizens stood in stark contrast to the heights of the Pax Romana period a few centuries prior. Gone were the days of relative peace, stability, and prosperity that had characterized much of the first 2 centuries AD. The Pax Romana, or Roman peace, was a golden age for the empire. Trade flourished across the Mediterranean, allowing goods, people, and ideas to flow freely. Majestic cities like Rome itself boasted populations of over 1 million, with grand public works like aqueducts, bathhouses, and amphitheatres. Even smaller towns enjoyed the benefits of Roman infrastructure and civic institutions. But by the late 400s, this world was but a fading memory. The political turmoil, economic decline, and outside invasions that plagued the late Western Empire made the Pax Romana seem like a distant dream. Cities that had once bustled with commerce and culture now lay in ruins or were shadows of their former selves. The elaborate road system and trade networks that knit the empire together fell into disrepair. Law and order broke down as central authority waned and local strongmen asserted control. It would have been hard for a Roman of the 5th century to believe that their civilization had once stretched from the British Isles to the Middle East and encompassed some 70 million people. The contrast was perhaps most stark in the eternal city of Rome itself. In the heyday of the Pax Romana, Rome was the largest and most splendid metropolis in the known world, a cosmopolitan capital adorned with majestic temples, palaces, public monuments and gardens. Its forums buzzed with political debate and philosophical discourse. Exotic goods from silk to spices flowed through its great markets. Lavish public spectacles entertained the masses. But by 476 AD, when the last Western emperor was deposed, Rome was an abandoned, starving city, its population having dwindled to perhaps 30,000. The mighty Roman legions that had once guarded the empire's frontiers were now a disorganized patchwork of foreign mercenaries. Everywhere a Roman of the 5th century looked, they would have seen a world in decay, a pale reflection of past glories. The Pax Romana was gone, and the Dark Ages were descending. As the empire crumbled around him, Flavius Aetius, a retired Roman senator, often found himself lost in memories of better days. He would sit in the courtyard of his villa on the outskirts of Rome, gazing at the overgrown gardens that had once been meticulously maintained by a staff of servants. The marble statues were now chipped and weathered, their faces worn smooth by time and neglect. Flavius remembered the grand feasts he had hosted in his younger years, when his home was filled with the laughter and chatter of fellow senators, wealthy merchants, and distinguished guests from far-off lands. They would dine on succulent roasted meats, exotic fruits, and the finest wines, while discussing politics, philosophy, and the latest gossip from the imperial court. He thought back to the days when Rome was the center of the world, a shining beacon of civilization and power. The city's streets were lined with magnificent temples, bustling markets, and grand public buildings, adorned with intricate mosaics and towering columns. The Roman legions were feared and respected across the known world, their discipline and prowess in battle unmatched. But now, as Flavius sat in his quiet courtyard, the city he had once loved was a mere shadow of its former self. The streets were filled with the desperate and the destitute, refugees from the provinces seeking safety within the city walls as barbarian tribes ravaged the countryside. Many of the grand buildings had fallen into disrepair, their once gleaming marble facades now stained and crumbling. The Senate, too, had lost much of its power and influence. The emperors of recent years had been weak and ineffectual, more concerned with their own pleasures and petty rivalries than with the welfare of the empire. Corruption and greed ran rampant, and the once mighty Roman legions struggled to defend the empire's borders against the relentless onslaught of barbarian invaders. As the sun began to set over the city, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Flavius sighed deeply. He knew that the Rome of his youth was gone, perhaps forever. The world was changing, and the empire he had once served so proudly was slowly crumbling from within. All he could do now was cling to his memories of better days, a bittersweet reminder of the glory and grandeur that had once been Rome's, and hope that somehow, someday, the eternal city might rise again from the ashes of its own decline. As the Western Roman Empire limped through the 5th century AD, a series of short-lived emperors struggled to hold together the fragmented remnants of a once mighty civilization. The last of these ill-fated rulers was a young man named Romulus Augustus, known derisively by the diminutive nickname Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus. His reign would prove to be the final chapter in the long, tumultuous history of ancient Rome. Romulus Augustulus came to power in 475 AD, at the tender age of 14 or 15, installed as a puppet emperor by his father, a powerful military commander named Orestes. The boy ruler inherited an empire crumbling under the weight of economic decline, political instability, and relentless pressure from Germanic tribes encroaching on Roman territories. Despite his youth and inexperience, Romulus Augustulus faced the daunting task of governing an empire that had lost much of its former glory. The Western Roman Empire at this time was a mere shadow of its former self, reduced to a rump state centered around the Italian peninsula. The imperial government in Ravenna, a fortress city on the Adriatic coast, clung tenuously to power. One of the most pressing challenges facing the young emperor was the growing discontent among the foederati, the Germanic mercenaries who made up a significant portion of the Roman military. These warriors, primarily from the Skirian, Heruli, and Torquelini tribes, had long served as allies of convenience for the Romans. In exchange for their military service, they were granted land and privileges within the empire. However, by the time of Romulus Augustulus, the foederati had grown increasingly dissatisfied with their treatment by the Roman authorities. They felt that they had not received the lands and rewards they had been promised, and tensions were running high. The situation came to a head in 476 AD, when the Germanic troops, led by a powerful general named Odoacer, rose up in rebellion against the Western Roman government. Odoacer, who had once served as a bodyguard for the previous emperor, Julius Nepos, was a formidable and ambitious figure. Of Germanic and Hunnic descent, he had risen through the ranks of the Roman military to become an influential leader among the foederati. Capitalizing on the growing resentment of his fellow Germanic warriors, Odoacer led a revolt against Orestes, the power behind the throne of Romulus Augustulus. In a swift and decisive campaign, Odoacer's forces marched on Ravenna, the capital of the Western Roman Empire. They quickly overwhelmed the city's defenses and captured Orestes, who was promptly executed. The young emperor Romulus Augustulus was spared, perhaps due to his youth or the fact that he posed little threat to Odoacer's ambitions. With Orestes dead and Romulus Augustulus deposed, Odoacer became the de facto ruler of Italy. In a symbolic gesture, he sent the imperial regalia of the Western Roman Empire to the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, effectively acknowledging that the Western Empire had come to an end. Zeno, in turn, granted Odoacer the title of Patrician, recognizing his authority over Italy. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 AD marked a watershed moment in European history. It signaled the end of the Western Roman Empire, which had dominated the Mediterranean world for centuries. The fall of Rome was not a sudden catastrophe, but rather the culmination of a long, gradual decline marked by invasions, political turmoil, economic struggles, and the loss of territories to various Germanic kingdoms. In the aftermath of Romulus Augustulus's deposition, Italy entered a new era under the rule of Odoacer and his successors, the Ostrogoths. The once mighty Roman Empire had fragmented into a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms, each with its own rulers, laws, and customs. The Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, would continue on for nearly another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire, but the Western Empire had breathed its last. The story of Romulus Augustulus and the fall of the Western Roman Empire is a poignant reminder of the impermanence of even the greatest of civilizations. It is a tale of decline, political intrigue, and the shifting tides of power that shaped the course of European history for centuries to come. As the sun set on the Roman world, a new age dawned, one in which the legacy of Rome would endure, but in a vastly different form, forever changed by the transformative events of 476 AD. As the Western Roman Empire continued its slow decline, the reins of power fell into the hands of a mere child. In the year 475 AD, a 12-year-old boy named Romulus Augustus was proclaimed emperor. Of course, at such a tender age, he was hardly fit to rule. The real power behind the throne was his father, a Roman general named Orestes. Orestes had once served as a secretary to Attila the Hun, but in a twist of fate, he now found himself pulling the strings of the Roman Empire. Through his young son, Orestes could effectively control the entire western half of the once mighty empire.